Welcome.
It was fun.
Welcome to Carpenters Hall. My name is Michael Norris. I'm the executive director here, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today as we commemorate a really special moment in American history, the invocation that marked the start of the First Continental Congress, which took place right here in Carpenters Hall, and took place 246 years ago today, September 7th, 1774. The Carpenters Company had been founded 50 years before that, in 1724, as a trade guild for master builders. The company still exists today, which a lot of people don't know, as a member-based professional association of architects, builders, and engineers, whose primary mission is to preserve this building and keep it open as a museum and research site. Early members of the Carpenters Company built much of 18th century Philadelphia, including many buildings that still exist today, including Independence Hall, the steeple at Christ Church, Pennsylvania Hospital, homes in Elford Valley, and of course, Carpenters Hall itself, which was constructed as a meeting place for the company in the early 1770s, and wasn't even completely finished when company leaders agreed to host the 56 delegates of the First Continental Congress here in the fall of 1774. What happened next is particularly relevant to our purpose today, and like so much of our revolutionary history, it was captured by John Adams, the future second president, who was a delegate to the First Continental Congress in Massachusetts, in a letter to his wife, Abigail. I'll let him tell the story. Quote, "When the Congress first met, Mr. Cushing made a motion that it should be opened with a prayer. It was opposed by Mr. Jay of New York and Mr. Rutledge of South Carolina, because we were so divided in religious sentiments, some Episcopalians, some Quakers, some Anabaptists, some Presbyterians, and some Congregationalists, so that we could not join in the same act of worship. Mr. Sam Adams arose and said he was no bigot and could hear a prayer from a gentleman of piety and virtue who was at the same time a friend to his country. He was a stranger in Philadelphia, but had heard that Mr. Jacob Duché deserved that character, and therefore he moved that Mr. Duché, an Episcopal clergyman, might be desired to read prayers to the Congress tomorrow morning. The motion was seconded and passed in the affirmative. Mr. Peyton Randolph, our president, waited on Mr. Duché and received for answer that if his health would permit, he certainly would. Accordingly, the next morning he appeared with his clerk and in his pontificals and read several prayers in the established form, and then read the collect for the 7th day of September, which was the 35th psalm. After this, Mr. Duché, unexpected to everybody, struck out into an extemporary prayer, which filled the bosom of every man present. I must confess I never heard a better prayer or one so well pronounced. It has had an excellent effect upon everybody here." End quote. Duché was the rector at Christ Church at 2nd and Market Street, which at that time was a unified congregation with St. Peter's Church at 3rd and Pine. We're fortunate to have representatives from both of these historic congregations with us today, who will recite Psalm 35 and Duché's powerful prayer. But first, please join me in welcoming our Pennsylvania State Representative, the Honorable Mary Isaacson.
Thank you for having me here today. My name is Mary Isaacson. I'm the representative from the 175th yard, and I'm a proud current caretaker of Ben Franklin Seed in Pennsylvania State House, which is now located in Harrisburg, but used to be just down the block. And I am a proud champion and happy to represent this historic district in the birthplace of our country. And I'm proud to see our flags flying, especially the one here in Pennsylvania, which I brought home from the state capitol because it used to hang over the capitol out in Harrisburg. And now it flies over this historic institution. And I would like to thank Carpenters Hall Executive Director Michael Norris for inviting me here today, as well as Christ Church and St. Peter's Church and the Independence National Historic Park. I would also like to acknowledge the members of the Carpenters Company for their caring and dedication they have shown preserving this building for almost 250 years. Carpenters Hall has been open to the public as a museum and historic site since 1857, and I think we can all agree that due to these members' efforts, she is certainly aged with grace. She's just a bit older than we thought, though. In fact, the General Assembly, as you just said, officially recognized Carpenters Hall as the birthplace of the Commonwealth since they hosted the Pennsylvania Provincial Conference in 1776. Before I get to the real reason we're here to celebrate, I want to take a moment to acknowledge how badly this pandemic has devastated our historic district, and in turn our great city and Commonwealth. Places like Carpenters Hall in Christchurch and St. Peter's, the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall, and so many other core pieces and places of our history have had to shut their doors to the public, and only recently have been able to open back up. I want to remind Philadelphians that the heartbeat of our country was born right here in this city. And it's a city we have the privilege to call home. And even though we call it home, there's still much to learn and discover from it. And it's vital that we support our historic institutions and museums so that we can preserve them and their history for generations to come when this pandemic is far behind us. Now for what we've gathered here today. On this day, 246 years ago, 12 of the 13 British colonies that eventually became the United States gathered to address the blockade at Boston Harbor after the infamous Boston Tea Party, as well as the punitive intolerable acts. But most importantly, they gathered here, right here, to agree collaborative response. They gathered here to work towards creating a common cause. In today's hyper-partisan world and walls between the different aisles of the legislature, it's important to recognize and celebrate this historic collaboration and a sense of unity among the colonies, especially as we navigate this pandemic that is too often divided the states. The First Continental Congress was the recognition and realization that the colonies needed to work together. As Patrick Henry famously said here, the distinction between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I'm not a Virginian, I'm an American. In collaboration and compromise, especially in the legislature, there is no weakness, but strength in working together for a common cause. Working together for a country in need, our country. As we leave this ceremony together and head our different ways, I hope you will take with you the values and lessons of our forefathers. I know that certainly I will, as I try to navigate through this pandemic, taking care of the 175th District and my constituents during this time. But we're here to celebrate, so let's do so, and thank you.
Thank you, Representative Isaacson. I'm now pleased to introduce Jennifer Childs, the vestry member at St. Peter's Church, who will recite Psalm 35.
Psalm 35. Contend, O Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take hold of shield and buckler and rise for my help. Draw the spear and javelin against my pursuers. Say to my soul, I am your deliverance. Let them be put to shame and dishonor who seek after my life. Let them be turned back and confounded who devise evil against me. Let them be like chaff before the wind, with the angel of the Lord driving them on. Let their way be dark and slippery, with the angel of the Lord pursuing them. For without cause they hid their net for me. Without cause they dug a pit for my life. Let ruin come upon them unawares, and let the net which they hid ensnare them. Let them fall therein to ruin. Then my soul shall rejoice in the Lord, exulting in his deliverance. All my bones shall say, O Lord, who is like thee, thou who deliverest the weak from him who is too strong for him, the weak and needy from him who despoils him. Malicious witnesses rise up. They ask me of things that I know not. They requite me evil for good. My soul is forlorn. But I, when they were sick, I wore sackcloth. I afflicted myself with fasting. I prayed with head bowed on my bosom. as though I grieved for my friend or my brother. I went about as one who laments his mother, bowed down and in mourning. But at my stumbling, they gathered in glee. They gathered together against me. Cripples whom I knew not slandered me without ceasing. They impiously mocked more and more, gnashing at me with their teeth. How long, O Lord, wilt thou look on? Rescue me from their ravages, my life from the lions. Then I will thank thee in the great congregation. In the mighty throng I will praise thee. Let not those rejoice over me who are wrongfully my foes. And let not those wink the eye who hate me without cause. For they do not speak peace, but against those who are quiet in the land they conceive words of deceit. They open wide their mouths against me. They say, aha, aha, our eyes have seen it. Thou hast seen, O Lord, be not silent. O Lord, be not far from me. Bestir thyself and awake for my right, for my cause, O God and my Lord. Vindicate me, O Lord my God, according to thy righteousness, and let them not rejoice over me. Let them not say to themselves, aha, we have our heart's desire. Let them not say, we have swallowed him up. Let them be put to shame and confusion altogether, who rejoice at my calamity. Let them be clothed with shame and dishonor, who magnify themselves against me. Let those who desire my vindication shout for joy and be glad, and say evermore, great is the Lord, who delights in the welfare of his servant. Then my tongue shall tell of thy righteousness, and of thy praise all the day long.
Thank you, Jen. Now please welcome to the podium the Reverend Susan Richardson, Assistant Minister at Christ Church, who will recite Boucher's prayer.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone. And as I prayer, imagine the scene that Michael and John Adams described so well of this range of people with different backgrounds of piety. All right, they were different denominations within Christianity, which to us these days might not seem like such a big deal, but it was then. And one of the ways they showed this, we know how physical we are. We were talking before this about how disembodied we've had to be during the pandemic, and how that shows us how physical we really do need to be. So physical shows of piety were really important. So after this presentation, when you get a chance to go inside, take a look at the drawing to the left of the moment that Boucher was praying this prayer, and you'll see how intentional it's shown how each person was showing a different form of piety, and this was a really big deal, actually. So imagine some people kneeling and their hands clasped, some people standing in a stately fashion, some with their heads bowed, and that's the truth that means this prayer was prayed. O Lord, our Heavenly Father, high and mighty, King of kings and Lord of lords, who dost from thy throne behold all the dwellers of the earth, and reignest with power supreme and uncontrolled over all the kingdoms, empires, and governments. Look down in mercy, we beseech thee, on these, our American states, who have fled to thee from the rod of the oppressor and thrown themselves on thy gracious protection, desiring to be henceforth dependent only on thee. To thee have they appealed for the righteousness of their cause. To thee do they now look up for that countenance and support which thou alone canst give. Take them, therefore, Heavenly Father, under thy nurturing care. Give them wisdom and counsel, valor in the field. Defeat the malicious designs of our cruel adversaries. Convince them of the unrighteousness of their cause, and if they persist in their sanguinary purposes, alone unburden justice, sounding in their hearts, constrain them to drop the weapons of war from their unnerved hands in the day of battle. Be thou present, O God of wisdom, and direct the counsels of this honorable assembly. Enable them to settle things on the best and surest foundation. That the scene of blood may be speedily closed, that order, harmony and peace may be effectually restored, and truth and justice, religion and piety prevail and flourish amongst the people. Preserve the health of their bodies and vigor of their minds. Shower down on them and the millions they here represent such temporal blessings as thou seest expedient for them in this world, and crown them with everlasting glory in the world to come. All this we ask in the name and through the merits of Jesus Christ, thy Son and our Savior. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Richardson. You do shades prepared the light for us. Now, to get a little more historical context on Duche and the invocation, please welcome Matt Ifill, Park Ranger here with our wonderful neighbors at Independence National Historical Park. Matt?
Well, good morning. For me personally, it's nice to be down here at Carpenters Hall. Usually you find me hanging around Independence Hall, sort of in the big picture, middle of the story, and here we are at the beginning, and I love to kind of look at this whole picture up to the Constitution. This idea of taking these 13 diverse colonies and all these separate people, sectional differences and religious differences and whatnot, and trying to find a way to invent something where we can all come together. And this building really is the first step in that, getting these colonies together and agreeing to an association going forward. And there's so many different things I could have talked about today, but since we're talking about Jacob Duche, I thought, well, why not talk about him? Because to me, he's this example of a lot of the tension that people are going to feel at this time. It's not a straightforward up and down, we're all agreeing or we're all not agreeing, we're all Tories or we're all Whigs. There's a lot of people that are getting pushed and pulled in different directions based on circumstances, and I think Duche really fits that. Even the idea of picking the rector of Christ Church, which is, Church of England, the main sort of stream church of the British world, to speak to these guys of all these different backgrounds, to me it's a brilliant decision. Not picking some radical guy off on the side, but picking somebody down the middle, and then he comes through. You've heard that prayer. And what's interesting to me about that prayer is that's a 1776 prayer, or maybe a 1771. It's a wartime prayer, isn't it? But the circumstances, the exact day he's here talking, kind of necessitated that, because the day before, the 6th, the day he was chosen to do this, we're getting news from Massachusetts of what's called the powder alarm. The British have gone out, raided, secured some powder, brought back some cannons, but the rumors that hit down here were that 5 people were killed, people were arming up to fight, Boston had been bombarded, so all these things that weren't necessarily true, but that's what's on people's minds. That's why probably John Adams likes this prayer so very much, because it hit exactly what's going on in his head. So I wanted to touch a couple of other things that Jacob Duche would have to say over the course of the next couple of years for you guys today. So I'll start with keeping in mind they liked him so much that when they first met in Independence Hall, what we call the Second Continental Congress, they brought him back to do the invocation there in 1775. But he gave a sermon in July 1775 at Christ Church, specifically to the 1st Battalion of the city of Philadelphia. So guys that had, formed up into the army. And he said to them in that sermon, it was based on book of the letter to the Galatians, chapter 5, verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free. So that's kind of his theme. And he says in his sermon, civil liberty is as much the gift of God, and consequently that we are bound to stand fast in our civil as well as spiritual freedom. He went on to say that no particular mode of government is pointed out to us in his holy gospel. Yet, the benevolent spirit of that gospel is directly opposed to every other form than such as the common good of mankind for its end and aim. He also would go on to say that our best writers, moral and political, clergy and laity, have asserted that true government can have no other foundation than common consent. And this is this idea of liberty. And this is a big theme for him in a lot of these sermons that we'll hear. Now, he does add another thing that's kind of a theme to his. As to any pretensions to, or even desire of independency, have we not openly disavowed them? Have we not repeatedly and solemnly professed an inviolable loyalty to the person, power, and dignity of our sovereign? Because again, keeping in mind, Church of England, King George is the head of that church. So that's another part of the duties that a man like Jacob Duché is going to have. And he finished with, I think, again, fitting perfectly to him. We contend not for victory, but for liberty and peace. Now, he dedicated that sermon to George Washington, and he wrote him a letter and sent him a version of it. And he said to Washington that, you know, if I have the least good influence upon the hearts and actions of the military freemen in America, that will be the best return I can concede. He says, he called it a labor of love. And then he said of Washington, I have long been an admirer of your amiable character and was glad of this opportunity to pay you a little tribute of respect. And then he said, my prayers are continuously for you and the brave troops under your command. Would to God a speedy and happy reconciliation could be accomplished without the effusion of one more drop of valuable blood. His other famous sermon that summer, 1775, is called The American Vine, and he says at that point, restore that brotherly union and concord. Again, that same idea. Alas, if arms must decide the unnatural contest, and heaven should even smile upon our righteous cause, our success cannot be purchased without many a tear on the part of the victor as well as the vanquished. Now this is summer of 1775 we're looking at, the beginning of the war itself. In July 1776, we're going to see another big change, and that's obviously the Declaration of Independence. And this is, again, going to put attention on a man like Jacob Duché. So the vestry at Christ Church are going to meet after independence is declared. And they will make this decision. Now, to give you a little context, there's no bishops in America at this point. One of the things they've been arguing for. So a lot of the leading clerics for the Anglican Church in America have kind of agreed that we're not going to pull the king out of the liturgy. It's not going to happen. Well, what happens at Christ Church when the vestry meets is, quote, it will be proper to omit those petitions in the liturgy wherein the King of Great Britain is prayed for, as inconsistent with said declaration. They would also go on to say, it is necessary for the peace and well-being of the churches to omit these. Now, that to me is an interesting little phrase, because the idea is, we're at the temper of the times. If we're starting to talk about the king, A, a lot of people might not come to church anymore, and B, they might get mad at us and do something to us or the churches. So, you know, we might not even agree with this idea, but it's something that we feel that we need to do. He is also going to be made officially the chaplain of the Continental Congress on July the 9th of 1776. And he will be the first ever chaplain of Congress for the U.S. He'll only serve that for a couple of months. Looking at his health and his other duties, he'll resign that position in October. But it's going to have an impact on him, because in September 1777, the British are going to march into Philadelphia. They're capturing the city. And what's interesting here is this Sunday after the British arrive, what's back in the liturgy but King George III all of a sudden. Nevertheless, though, poor Jacob Duché is going to be arrested, imprisoned, charged with treason for being connected to the Continental Congress. And all this is happening very quickly. Within less than 2 weeks, he's going to write this rather notorious letter to George Washington. And he will say, the sermon he dedicated to Washington speaks for itself and utterly disclaims the idea of independence. He says, a very few days after the fatal Declaration of Independence, I was appointed chaplain to the Congress. Surprised and distressed, I rashly accepted the appointment. Now he says of Congress, independency was the idol which they had long wished to set up, and rather than sacrifice this, they would deluge their country in blood. Kind of strong. He goes on to criticize the members of Congress as not being very capable. Specifically to Pennsylvania members, he said, as to those of my own province, some of them are so obscure that their names had never met my ears before, and others have been distinguished only by the weakness of their undertakings and the violence of their tempers. Are the dregs of a Congress then still to influence a mind like yours? He says to George Washington. These are not the men you engaged to serve. These are not the men that America has chosen to represent her. He says that France is not going to join us. He knows that for a fact. He says the British have won battle after battle. They walked right into Philadelphia without much effort. He says, how fruitless the expense of blood. And then he asks Washington, represent to Congress the indispensable necessity of rescinding the hasty and ill-advised Declaration of Independence. Recommend an immediate cessation of hostilities. Be assured, sir, I write this not under the eye of any British officer or any person connected with the British Army or Ministry. The sentiments I have expressed are the real sentiments of my own heart. Now, what's George Washington to do with a letter like this when he gets it? Well, he's going to send it to John Hancock, to Congress, and he's going to write a little note with it. He says, I yesterday received a letter of a very curious and extraordinary nature from Mr. Duché, which I have thought proper to transmit to Congress. To this ridiculous, illiberal performance, notwithstanding the author's assertion, I cannot but suspect that the measure did not originate with him, that he was induced to it by the hope of establishing his interests and peace more effectually with the enemy. Washington also wrote to Francis Hawkins, who was the brother-in-law of Jacob Duché, and he said, I am still willing to suppose that it was dictated by his fears than his real sentiments. And Hawkinson agreed, saying, I've said no this man forever. Clearly he had to be under some kind of threat. Well, that's what they all hope, but it's hard to say for sure, because a lot of it is kind of consistent with a lot of the pushing and pulling that's happening to Mr. Duché. And then the other thing that's going to hurt him is December of 1777, he gets on a ship with General Cornwallis, and he goes over to England, where he will remain for 15 years. His family will flee to New York when the British leave Philadelphia, and they will in turn go to England in a couple of years as well. Now, he does ask to come back. We're not really interested in loyalists coming back in those years right after the war. He writes to George Washington in 1783 saying, hey, can you put in a good word for me? I'd like to come back to Pennsylvania. So he writes another letter to George Washington when he becomes president. And he says, President Washington, I long for the return of all the exiled citizens, and suffer to reside with them either as British subjects or as a fellow citizen upon taking an oath of allegiance. There's no evidence that Washington ever wrote him back. He does get to come back to Philadelphia in 1792. In fact, he's buried at St. Peter's Churchyard. If you want to go and pay your respects to Reverend Duché, he's down there today. At least I hope he is. But here's the thing. As I looked into Duché, I really kind of see a bit of a microcosm for what we were facing starting in this building. And that's this great diversity of people with long-standing loyalties to Britain. They thought of themselves as British. And, he can get swept up in things. When he's sitting here doing this prayer, or when he's preaching to the soldiers going off to war. And even after the Declaration of Independence. And I think another part of Duché, a little bit of him was also one of those people who it was important to be important in a way, to matter. So when the Americans were in charge, he wanted to matter. When the British were in charge, sort of brings him back to the past, and I have to kind of go back to those roots that I had. And so to me, again, this is that struggle that we faced for those early years. And to a degree, we still face as we look at the world today, is how to incorporate all this great diversity and variety that we've always had. And so looking at a story like Jacob Duché really, I think, is kind of illustrated for us. So thank you all for coming out today.
That concludes our program. I want to thank Christ Church and St. Peter's and Independence National Historical Park for partnering with us today. We do have some late refreshments inside, so please, after we're done here, you're welcome to come in. If you haven't already, check out the artifacts we have from the First Continental Congress, including the original speaker's chair. As Reverend Richardson mentioned, we do have a famous portrait of Duché's invocation that you can that's on the temporary display right now, as well as a really amazing artist sketch of the mural of the First Continental Congress that's in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. There's an accessible entrance around the side for anyone who needs that. And please be mindful of the city's COVID guidelines. We're only allowed to have 10 people in the hall at a time, so don't all rush. but we'd love to see you in there. And finally, come back here on October 26th. We'll be commemorating the end of the First Continental Congress on that day with some dramatic readings of the Declaration of Colonial Rights and some other statements that were put out by the Congress. So thank you again for coming and enjoy your day.